A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Letter and Introduction by Mary Wollstonecraft, read by Lisa M. Kendrick. To Monsieur Talleyrand Perigord, the late Bishop of Autun. Sir, having read with great pleasure a pamphlet which you have lately published on national education, I dedicate this volume to you, the first dedication that I have ever written, to induce you to read it with attention, and because I think that you will understand me, which I do not suppose many pert witlings will, who may ridicule the arguments they are unable to answer. But, sir, I carry my respect for your understanding still farther, so far that I am confident you will not throw my work aside and hastily conclude that I am in the wrong because you did not view the subject in the same light yourself. And pardon my frankness, but I must observe that you treated in too cursory a manner and contented to consider it as it had been considered formerly, when the rights of man, not to advert to woman, were trampled on as chimerical. I call upon you, therefore, now to weigh what I have advanced respecting the rights of woman and national education, and I call with a firm tone of humanity. For my arguments, sir, are dictated by a disinterested spirit. I plead for my sex, not for myself. Independence I have long considered as the grand blessing of life, the basis of every virtue, and independence I will ever secure by contracting my wants, though I were to live on a barren heath. It is then an affection for the whole human race that makes my pen dart rapidly along to support what I believe to be the cause of virtue. And the same motive leads me earnestly to wish to see woman placed in a station in which she would advance, instead of retarding, the progress of those glorious principles that give a substance to morality. My opinion, indeed, respecting the rights and duties of woman seems to flow so naturally from these same simple principles, that I think it scarcely possible but that some of the enlarged minds who formed your admirable constitution will coincide with me. In France, there is undoubtedly a more general diffusion of knowledge than in any part of the European world, and I attribute it in great measure to the social intercourse which has long subsisted between the sexes. It is true, I utter my sentiments with freedom, that in France the very essence of sensuality has been extracted to regale the voluptuary, and a kind of sentimental lust has prevailed, which, together with the system of duplicity that the whole tenor of their political and civil government taught, have given a sinister sort of sagacity to the French character, properly termed finesse, and a polish of manners that endures the substance by hunting sincerity out of society. And modesty, the fairest garb of virtue, has been more grossly insulted in France than even in England, till their women have treated as prudish that attention to decency which brutes instinctively observe. Manners and morals are so nearly allied that they have often been confounded. But though the former should only be the natural reflection of the latter, yet, when various causes have produced factitious and corrupt manners which are very early caught, morality becomes an empty name. The personal reserve and sacred respect for cleanliness and delicacy in domestic life, which French women almost despise, are the graceful pillars of modesty, but far from despising them, if the pure flame of patriotism have reached their bosoms, they should labor to improve the morals of their fellow citizens by teaching men not only to respect modesty in women, but to acquire it themselves as the only way to merit their esteem. Contending for the rights of women, my main argument is built upon this simple principle, that if she be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge. For truth must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious with respect to its influence on general practice. And how can woman be expected to cooperate unless she know why she ought to be virtuous? Unless freedom strengthen her reason till she comprehend her duty and see in what manner it is connected with her real good. If children are to be educated to understand the true principle of patriotism, their mother must be a patriot. And the love of mankind, from which an orderly train of virtue spring, can only be produced by considering the moral and civil interest of mankind. But the education and situation of woman at present shuts her out from such investigations. In this work, I have produced many arguments which to me were conclusive to prove that the prevailing notion respecting a sexual character was subversive of morality, and I have contended that to render the human body and mind more perfect, chastity must more universally prevail, and that chastity will never be respected in the male world till the person of a woman is not, as it were, idolized, when little virtue or sense of embellish it with grand traces of mental beauty or the interesting simplicity of affection. Consider, sir, dispassionately these observations, for a glimpse of this truth seemed to open before you when you observed that to see one half of the human race excluded by the other from all participation of government was a political phenomenon that, according to abstract principles, it was impossible to explain. If so, on what does your constitution rest? If the abstract rights of man will bear discussion and explanation, those of woman, by a parity of reasoning, will not shrink from the same test, though a different opinion prevails in this country, built on the very arguments which you use to justify the oppression of woman, prescription. Consider I address you as a legislator, whether, when men contend for their freedom and to be allowed to judge for themselves respecting their own happiness, it be not inconsistent and unjust to subjugate women, even though you firmly believe that you are acting in the manner best calculated to promote their happiness. Who made man the exclusive judge if woman partake with him the gift of reason? In this style argue tyrants of every denomination, from the weak king to the weak father of a family. They are all eager to crush reason, yet always assert that they usurp its throne only to be useful. Do you not act a similar part when you force all women, by denying them civil and political rights, to remain immured in their families, groping in the dark? For surely, sir, you will not assert that a duty can be binding which is not founded on reason. If indeed this be their destination, arguments may be drawn from reason and thus augustly supported. The more understanding women acquire, the more they will be attached to their duty, comprehending it. For unless they comprehend it, unless their morals be fixed on the same immutable principles as those of man, no authority can make them discharge it in a virtuous manner. They may be convenient slaves, but slavery will have its constant effect, degrading the master and the subject dependent. But if women are to be excluded without having a voice from a participation of the natural rights of mankind, prove first, to ward off the charge of injustice and inconsistency, that they want reason. Else this flaw in your new constitution, the first constitution founded on reason, will ever show that man must, in some shape, act like a tyrant, and tyranny, in whatever part of society it bears its brazen front, will ever undermine morality. I have repeatedly asserted and produced what appeared to me irrefragable arguments drawn from matters of fact to prove my assertion that women cannot by force be confined to domestic concerns, for they will, however ignorant, intermeddle with more weighty affairs, neglecting private duties only to disturb by cunning tricks the orderly plans of reason which rise above their comprehension. Besides, whilst they are only made to require personal accomplishments, men will seek for pleasure in variety, and faithless husbands will make faithless wives. Such ignorant beings indeed will be very excusable when, not taught to respect public good, nor allowed any civil right, they attempt to do themselves justice by retaliation. The box of mischief thus opened in society, what is to preserve private virtue and only security of public freedom and universal happiness? Let there be no coercion established in society. And the common law of gravity prevailing, the sexes will fall into their proper places. And now that more equitable laws are forming your citizens, marriage may become more sacred. Your young men may choose wives from motives of affection, and your maidens will allow love to root out vanity. The father of a family will not then weaken his constitution and debase his sentiments by visiting the harlot, nor forget, in obeying the call of appetite, the purpose for which it was implanted. And the mother will not neglect her children to practice the arts of coquetry, when sense and modesty secure her the friendship of her husband. But till men become attentive to the duty of a father, it is vain to expect women to spend that time in their nursery which they, wise in their generation, choose to spend at their glass. For this exertion of cunning is only an instinct of nature to enable them to obtain indirectly a little of that power of which they are unjustly denied a share. For if women are not permitted to enjoy legitimate rights, they will render both men and themselves vicious to obtain illicit privileges. I wish, sir, to set investigations of this kind afloat in France, and should they lead to a confirmation of my principles when your constitution is revised, the rights of woman may be respected, if it be fully proved that reason calls for this respect, and loudly demands justice for one half of the human race. I am, sir, yours respectfully, Mary Wollstonecraft. Introduction. After considering the historic page and viewing the living world with anxious solicitude, the most melancholy emotions of sorrowful indignation have depressed my spirits, and I have sighed when obliged to confess that either nature has made a great difference between man and man, or that the civilization which has hitherto taken place in the world has been very partial. I have turned over various books written on the subject of education, and patiently observed that conduct of parents and the management of schools. But what has been the result? A profound conviction that the neglected education of my fellow creatures is the grand source of the misery I deplore, and that women in particular are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes, originating from one hasty conclusion. The conduct and manners of women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state. For, like flowers that are planted in too rich a soil, strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased a fastidious eye, fade, disregarded on the stalk, long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. One cause of this barren blooming I attribute to a false system of education gathered from the books written on this subject by men who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than rational wives. And the understanding of the sex has been so bubbled by this specious homage that the civilized women of the present century, with a few exceptions, are only anxious to inspire love when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition, and by their abilities and virtues exact respect. In a treatise, therefore, on female rights and manners, the works which have been particularly written for their improvement must not be overlooked, especially when it is asserted in direct terms that the minds of women are enfeebled by thought's refinement, that the books of instruction written by men of genius have had the same tendency as more frivolous productions, and that, in the true style of Mahometanism, they are only considered as females and not as a part of the human species, when improvable reason is allowed to be dignified distinction, which raises men above the brute creation and puts a natural scepter in a feeble hand. Yet, because I am a woman, I would not lead my readers to suppose that I mean violently to agitate the contested question respecting the equality and inferiority of the sex, but as the subject lies in my way, and I cannot pass it over without subjecting the main tendency of my reasoning to misconstruction, I shall stop a moment to deliver in a few words my opinion. In the government of the physical world, it is observable that the female in general is inferior to the male. The male pursues, the female yields. This is the law of nature, and it does not appear to be suspended or abrogated in favor of women. This physical superiority cannot be denied, and it is a noble prerogative. But not content with this natural preeminence, men endeavor to sink us still lower, merely to render us alluring objects for the moment. And women, intoxicated by the adoration which men, under the influence of their senses, pay them, do not seek to obtain a durable interest in their hearts, or to become the friends of the fellow creatures who find amusement in their society. I am aware of an obvious inference. From every quarter have I heard exclamations against masculine women. But where are they to be found, if, by this appellation, men mean to inveigh against their ardor in hunting, shooting, and gaming? I shall most cordially join in the cry, but if it be against the imitation of manly virtues, or, more properly speaking, the attainment of those talents and virtues, the exercise of which ennobles the human character, and which raise females in the scale of animal being, when they are comprehensively termed mankind, all those who view them with a philosophical eye must, I should think, wish with me that they may every day grow more and more masculine. This discussion naturally divides the subject. I shall first consider women in the grand light of human creatures who, in common with men, are placed on this earth to unfold their faculties. And afterwards, I shall more particularly point out their peculiar designation. I wish also to steer clear of an error, which many respectable writers have fallen into, for the instruction which has hitherto been addressed to women has rather been applicable to ladies, if the little indirect advice that is scattered through Sandford and Merton be accepted. But, addressing my sex in a firmer tone, I pay particular attention to those in the middle class, because they appear to be in the most natural state. Perhaps the seeds of false refinement, immorality, and vanity have ever been shed by the great. Weak, artificial beings raised above the common wants and affections of their race in a premature and unnatural manner undermine the very foundation of virtue and spread corruption through the whole mass of society. As a class of mankind, they have the strongest claim to pity. The education of the rich tends to render them vain and helpless, and the unfolding mind is not strengthened by the practice of those duties which dignify the human character. They only live to amuse themselves, and by the same law which in nature invariably produces certain effects, they soon only afford a barren amusement. But as I purpose taking a separate view of the different ranks of society and of the moral character of women, in each this hint is, for the present, sufficient. And I have only alluded to the subject because it appears to me to be the very essence of an introduction to give a cursory account of the contents of the work it introduces. My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures, instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I earnestly wish to point out in what true dignity and human happiness consists. I wish to persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength, both of mind and body, and to convince them that the soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness, and that those beings who are only the objects of pity and that kind of love which has been termed its sister will soon become objects of contempt. Dismissing then those pretty feminine phrases which the men condescendingly use to soften our slavish dependence, and despising that weak elegancy of mind, exquisite sensibility, and sweet docility of manners supposed to be the sexual characteristics of the weaker vessel, I wish to show that elegance is inferior to virtue, that the first object of laudable ambition is to obtain a character as a human being, regardless of the distinction of sex, and that secondary views should be brought to this simple touchstone. This is a rough sketch of my plan, and should I express my conviction with the energetic emotions that I feel whenever I think of the subject, the dictates of experience and reflection will be felt by some of my readers. Animated by this important object, I shall disdain to cull my phrases or polish my style. I aim at being useful, and sincerity will render me unaffected, for wishing rather to persuade by the force of my arguments than dazzle by the elegance of my language. I shall not waste my time in rounding periods, nor in fabricating the turgid bombast of artificial feelings which, coming from the head, never reach the heart. I shall be employed about things, not words, and anxious to render my sex more respectable members of society. I shall try to avoid that flowery diction which has slided from essays into novels and from novels into familiar letters and conversation. These pretty nothings, these caricatures of the real beauty of sensibility dropping glibly from the tongue, vitiate the taste and create a kind of sickly delicacy that turns away from simple, unadorned truth. And a deluge of false sentiments and overstretched feelings, stifling the natural emotions of the heart, render the domestic pleasures insipid that ought to sweeten the exercise of those severe duties which educate a rational and immortal being for a nobler field of action. The education of women has of late been more attended to than formerly, yet they are still reckoned a frivolous sex, and ridiculed or pitied by the writers who endeavor by satire or instruction to improve them. It is acknowledged that they spend many of the first years of their lives in acquiring a smattering of accomplishments. Meanwhile, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to libertine notions of beauty, to the desire of establishing themselves. The only way women can rise in the world? By marriage. And this desire making mere animals of them when they marry. They act as such children may be expected to act. They dress, they paint, and nickname God's creatures. Surely these weak beings are only fit for the seraglio. Can they govern a family or take care of the poor babes whom they bring into the world? If then it can be fairly deduced from the present conduct of the sex, from the prevalent fondness for pleasure which takes place of ambition, and those nobler passions that open and enlarge the soul, that the instruction which women have received has only tended, with the constitution of civil society, to render them insignificant objects of desire, mere propagators of fools. If it can be proved that in aiming to accomplish them without cultivating their understandings, they are taken out of their sphere of duties and made ridiculous and useless when the short-lived bloom of beauty is over, I presume that rational men will excuse me for endeavoring to persuade them to become more masculine and respectable. Indeed, the word masculine is only a bugbear. There is little reason to fear that women will acquire too much courage or fortitude, for their apparent inferiority with respect to bodily strength must render them, in some degree, dependent on men in the various relations of life. But why should it be increased by prejudices that give a sex to virtue, and confound simple truths with sensual reveries? Women are, in fact, so much degraded by mistaken notions of female excellence that I do not mean to add a paradox when I assert that this artificial weakness produces a propensity to tyrannize. And it gives birth to cunning, that natural opponent of strength, which leads them to play off these contemptible infantile airs that undermine esteem even whilst they excite desire. Do not foster these prejudices, and they will naturally fall into the subordinate, yet respectable station in life. It seems scarcely necessary to say that I now speak of the sex in general. Many individuals have more sense than their male relatives, and as nothing preponderates where there is a constant strength for an equilibrium, without it has naturally more gravity. Some women govern their husbands without degrading themselves, because intellect will always govern.